The wind was already whispering before anyone noticed it was saying something different. It moved softly along the forest ridge, slipping between tall pines and crooked oaks, as if it had learned their names long ago. Most nights, the sound it made was easy to ignore, just another lonely breath passing through the trees. But on this night, the wind carried something else. A hush that felt deliberate. A rhythm that felt watched. Even the insects seemed to sense it, their usual chorus fading into uneasy silence as the darkness settled deeper into the woods. The forest ridge sat far from the nearest town, a long stretch of uneven land where the ground dipped and rose like a frozen wave. People used to hike there during the day, but once the sun sank behind the hills, the path was abandoned. Locals said the wind behaved strangely at night, that it moved against itself, circling instead of passing through. Most laughed it off as stories meant to scare children. Still, no one stayed after dusk, not anymore. Ethan learned about the ridge the hard way. He had arrived in town only 3 days earlier, carrying little more than a duffel bag and a heavy feeling he couldn't explain. He told people he needed quiet, that he wanted space to think. What he didn't say was that sleep had become impossible for him. Every night, just as he drifted off, he heard something stirring, like a breath too close to his ear. A sound that pulled him awake before his dreams could settle. The cabin he rented sat at the edge of the forest, just below the ridge. It was old but solid, with a narrow porch and a single light that flickered whenever the wind picked up. The owner warned him about the nights, said the forest had a way of getting loud when it felt ignored. Ethan smiled politely, assuming it was just another small-town superstition. He didn't know how closely the wind was already listening. That first evening, as the sky darkened and the trees became tall shadows, Ethan sat on the porch with a cup of cooling tea. The air felt heavier than it should have, pressing down on his chest in a way that made him take slow, careful breaths. Somewhere deeper in the forest, the wind shifted, brushing the treetops with a sound that almost resembled a sigh. He froze, listening. The sound came again, longer this time. Not sharp, not loud. Just enough to feel intentional. Ethan told himself it was nothing. Wind did strange things in places like this. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was reacting to him. Like the forest had noticed his presence and was adjusting accordingly. As night fully settled in, the wind grew bolder. It slipped through the branches and down the slope of a ridge, curling around the cabin as if testing its walls. The porch light flickered twice, then steadied. Ethan stood, suddenly tired in a way that felt deeper than physical exhaustion. He went inside, closed the door, and locked it, though he wasn't sure why. Sleep came slowly. When it did, it was thin and uneasy, like resting on the edge of a dream instead of falling into one. Sometime after midnight, Ethan stirred. He wasn't sure what had woken him at first. Then he heard it. The wind again. But this time, it wasn't just moving past the cabin. It was lingering. The sound slid along the walls, gentle but persistent, as though tracing the shape of the room. It slipped beneath the doorframe and brushed the curtains, causing them to sway even though the windows were closed. Ethan sat up in bed, heart beating faster now, his breath shallow. And then, beneath the soft rush of air, he heard something that made his blood turn cold. A whisper. Not a word he could understand. Not yet. Just the faint shape of a voice, woven into the wind itself, rising and falling as if it were searching for something. Or someone. Ethan stayed perfectly still, afraid that even the smallest movement would draw it closer. The whisper drifted toward the ridge, pulling away from the cabin, as though inviting him to follow. As the sound faded, one thought settled heavily in his mind. The wind wasn't wandering. It had found something, and whatever it was, it had only just begun to speak. Ethan did not sleep after that. He lay there with his eyes open, staring at the dark ceiling as the silence slowly returned. The wind moved away from the cabin, retreating up the forest ridge, but its presence lingered in the room. The air felt disturbed, like something invisible had passed through and left a trace behind. Every small sound, the creak of wood, the soft tick of cooling metal, made his muscles tighten. When morning finally arrived, it came gently, as if the forest didn't want to admit what had happened during the night. Pale light slipped through the trees, and birds began calling as though nothing was wrong. From the outside, the cabin looked peaceful, ordinary. Ethan almost convinced himself that the whisper had been a dream. Almost. He stepped onto the porch, breathing in the cold morning air. The forest ridge loomed above him, wrapped in a thin layer of fog that clung to the trees like a secret refusing to lift. The wind was quiet now, barely moving the leaves. Too quiet. Ethan found himself listening anyway, half expecting the whisper to return. Down the dirt road, a pickup truck passed slowly. The driver raised a hand in greeting, but didn't stop. Ethan noticed how quickly the truck disappeared, as if no one liked lingering near the ridge for long. That thought stayed with him as he finished unpacking and tried to settle into the routine he had promised himself he'd follow here. By afternoon, curiosity began to outweigh his unease. Ethan had always believed that understanding something took away its power. He told himself that if he walked the ridge in daylight, saw it clearly, whatever fear he felt would loosen its grip. The path was narrow but visible, winding upward through tall trees and uneven ground. Sunlight filtered through the branches, breaking into shifting patterns on the forest floor. As he climbed, the air changed. It grew cooler, heavier, and strangely still. The sounds of the town faded behind him, replaced by a quiet that felt too complete. Even his footsteps seemed muted, swallowed by the earth. He stopped once, turning slowly, certain he had heard movement just out of sight. Nothing. At the top of the ridge, the land flattened into a small clearing. Old stones were scattered near the edge, arranged in no clear pattern. They looked weathered, as though they'd been there longer than the trees themselves. Ethan crouched near one, brushing away dirt and moss. The surface beneath was smooth, worn by time and touch. A faint breeze passed through the clearing, stirring the leaves. For a moment, Ethan thought he heard the whisper again, softer now, stretched thin like a memory. He straightened quickly, scanning the trees. The wind shifted. It circled the clearing once, then slipped away, moving downslope toward the cabin. Ethan stood there longer than he meant to, his chest tight, the sense of being watched creeping back in. When he finally turned to leave, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. Footprints. They were shallow, barely pressed into the dirt, and they didn't match his own. They led toward the center of the clearing, then stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had simply vanished. Ethan backed away, his pulse quickening, and hurried back down the path. That night, he didn't light the porch lamp. He sat in the dark, listening as the forest settled around him. The whispering wind returned just after midnight, moving slowly this time, almost patiently. It brushed against the cabin again, softer than before, as though testing whether he was awake. He was. The sound slid along the walls, slipping into the cracks and seams, carrying with it that same shape of a voice. This time, it felt closer, more focused. Ethan held his breath, afraid the wind would sense it and press nearer. Instead, the whisper drifted past the cabin and continued toward the ridge. Sleep eventually claimed him, but it was restless and broken. He dreamed of standing in the clearing again, the stones arranged differently now, forming a loose circle. The wind moved through them, lifting dust and leaves, and somewhere within that movement, something tried to speak. He woke with his heart racing. The following day, Ethan went into town. He told himself he needed supplies, but really he wanted answers. The local store was small and quiet, its shelves lined with goods that looked like they'd been there forever. Behind the counter stood an older woman with tired eyes. She watched him carefully as he set his items down. "You're staying by the ridge," she said, not asking. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Is there something wrong with it?" The woman paused before ringing him up. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the forest could just be seen in the distance. "That place listens," she said quietly. "And it remembers." Before Ethan could ask what she meant, a bell chimed at the door. Another customer entered, and the woman's expression closed off. The moment passed, but the words stayed with him. That night, the whisper returned earlier than before. The wind rose as the sky darkened, moving faster now, more restless. It curled around the cabin, pressing against the walls as though drawn by something inside. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, gripping the sheets, his thoughts racing. The whisper grew clearer. Still not words. Not exactly. But the sound carried intention now, a rhythm that tugged at him, pulling his attention toward the ridge. Images flickered in his mind, stones, shadows, the clearing bathed in moonlight. A feeling settled in his chest, heavy and unavoidable. The wind was calling. Ethan stood before he realized he was moving. He stopped himself at the door, his hand hovering over the handle. Every instinct told him to stay inside, to lock the door and wait for morning. But the whisper pressed closer, sliding beneath the door, wrapping around his thoughts. Whatever the wind had found, it was no longer content to wait. And this time, it felt like it wanted him to follow. Ethan did not open the door that night. He stood there for a long time, his hand still hovering near the handle, while the whispering wind moved just beyond the thin, wooden frame. It seemed to wait, stretching the silence, as if giving him time to change his mind. When he finally stepped back, the air shifted, disappointed somehow, and the wind slowly withdrew toward the forest ridge. The quiet that followed felt heavier than the sound itself. The next morning, Ethan woke with a dull ache behind his eyes, the kind that came from thinking too much and sleeping too little. The dream lingered with him, fragments of stone and shadow clinging to his thoughts as he moved through the cabin. Outside, the forest looked unchanged, calm even. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and the ridge stood still, as if nothing strange had ever happened there. But Ethan felt different. He noticed it in small ways at first. The way his attention kept drifting toward the trees. The way every breeze made him pause. It felt as though part of him had been left behind in the clearing, listening to something he couldn't quite hear anymore. The whisper was gone for now, but its absence only sharpened his awareness of the forest. By late afternoon, he found himself walking into town again. This time, he didn't pretend it was for supplies. He went straight to the small diner near the edge of the road, the one place where locals gathered long enough to talk. He took a seat at the counter, listening more than speaking, letting the low hum of conversation wash over him. That's when he heard the ridge mentioned. A man near the end of the counter was telling a story in a careful, measured voice. Not loud enough to draw attention, but not quiet either. He spoke of strange winds, of sounds carried too clearly across distances they shouldn't cross, of people who swore they heard their names whispered when no one else was around. Ethan turned slightly, pretending to stir his coffee. "They say the forest keeps what it takes," the man said. "Not bodies, just pieces." No one laughed. A woman across from him shook her head. "It's the wind," she replied. "Always has been. It remembers things people forget." Ethan finally spoke. "What kind of things?" The conversation paused. Several faces turned toward him, their expressions guarded. The man studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Memories," he said. "Regrets. Sometimes voices." Ethan left shortly after, his questions unanswered, but his unease deepened. The idea settled into his thoughts, uncomfortable and persistent. What if the whisper wasn't a voice at all? What if it was something else, something shaped by what the forest had already taken? That night, the wind returned quietly. It did not rush the cabin or circle it like before. Instead, it stayed near the trees, brushing their tops with soft, steady movement. The sound was almost calming, if Ethan ignored the way it seemed to lean closer whenever his thoughts wandered. He sat by the window, watching the dark forest sway. The whisper came and went in fragments, never fully forming, as though testing how much he could bear. Each time it faded, it left behind a feeling of expectation. Across town, someone else was listening too. Mara had lived near the forest ridge her entire life. She had learned young that the wind there behaved differently, that it carried echoes others couldn't hear. She worked the late shift at the gas station, where the hum of lights and passing cars helped drown out the sounds she didn't want to remember. That night, as she locked the doors and stepped outside, the wind shifted. It brushed past her ear, carrying a familiar tone. Not a voice she heard clearly, but one she recognized all the same. Her shoulders tensed, and she stood still, eyes closed, listening despite herself. "It's starting again," she whispered. She drove home with the windows up, but the feeling followed her. Somewhere along the ridge, something was stirring. She knew it the way you know a storm is coming long before the clouds appear. Back at the cabin, Ethan dreamed again. This time, the clearing was empty. The stones were half buried, and the ground was marked with shallow impressions, as if many feet had stood there once. The wind moved through the space, slower now, heavier, carrying whispers that overlapped and tangled together. He woke just before dawn, his heart pounding. The days that followed blurred together. The whisper didn't return every night, but the wind never fully settled either. Ethan began to notice patterns. The way it always moved toward the ridge. The way it grew stronger when he thought about leaving. Almost as if the forest sensed his hesitation and responded to it. He started writing things down, notes about the sounds, the timing, the way the air felt before the whisper appeared. It was easier to believe he was studying something than to admit it felt like something was studying him in return. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the forest darkened, a knock sounded at the cabin door. Ethan froze. The wind was still. He opened the door slowly to find a woman standing on the porch. She looked uneasy, her eyes flicking past him toward the trees. "You're the one staying here," she said. "By the ridge." "Yes," Ethan replied. "Do you hear it too?" Her expression tightened. "I was hoping you wouldn't." They stood there in silence for a moment, the forest watching, the wind holding its breath. Somewhere above them, along the ridge, the air began to shift again. And whatever had been waiting in the whisper seemed to draw just a little closer. Mara didn't step inside the cabin. She stayed on the porch, close to the edge, as if she needed a clear path back to the road. The air between her and Ethan felt tight, stretched thin by everything neither of them was saying. Behind them, the forest ridge rose dark and quiet, listening. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. "Not this close. Not now." Ethan glanced toward the trees. The wind had gone still again, the kind of stillness that felt temporary, like a held breath. "You said it's starting again," he replied. "What is?" Mara hesitated. "The calling," she said at last. "That's what my grandmother used to call it. When the wind begins to gather memories. Voices. Things people don't let go of." Ethan felt a chill move through him. "It's been whispering to me." Mara's eyes flicked back to his. "Then it's already found you." She finally stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The cabin felt smaller with someone else in it, the shadows deeper. Ethan poured her a glass of water, noticing the slight shake in her hands as she accepted it. She took a sip, steadying herself, then began to speak in a low, careful voice. "When I was a kid," she said, "people went missing. Not often. Just enough for it to feel wrong. They'd walk up the ridge and never come back the same. Some forgot things. Some forgot people. Some left town and never spoke about it again." Ethan thought of the footprints in the clearing, how they stopped without explanation. And the wind. "The wind keeps what's offered," Mara said. "Or what's taken." Outside, the first breeze of the evening slipped through the trees. The cabin creaked softly as it adjusted. Both of them went quiet listening. The sound was faint at first, barely more than a sigh, but it carried direction, purpose. "It's earlier than usual," Mara murmured. "That's not good." The whisper crept closer as the light faded. It moved around the cabin, slow and patient, brushing the walls like fingertips testing a surface. Ethan felt it pressing against his thoughts again, images rising uninvited. The clearing, the stones, the sense of standing where others had stood before. Mara stood, drawn toward the window. "It wants you to come up there," she said. "It always does." Ethan swallowed. "Why me?" She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was barely above the wind. "Because you're listening." The whisper grew stronger, threading itself through the branches, carrying a layered sound now. Not one voice, but many overlapping softly. Ethan felt his chest tighten as the cabin filled with that low, restless presence. It wasn't violent. It wasn't angry. It was persistent. Outside, the trees began to sway. Mara grabbed her jacket. "We shouldn't wait," she said. "Once it builds enough, it doesn't stop." Ethan followed her out into the night before he could second-guess himself. The forest path was darker than he remembered, the shadows thicker, the air cooler. The wind guided them, moving ahead, stirring leaves along the trail like markers leading upward. As they climbed, the whisper sharpened. Not clearer, but closer. Ethan could feel it brushing against his awareness, tugging gently, insistently. Memories surfaced without warning. Moments he hadn't thought about in years. Words left unsaid. Choices left behind. "This is how it works," Mara said, breathless. "It pulls from you, little by little." The clearing came into view, washed in pale moonlight. The stones were fully exposed now, arranged in a loose circle, just as Ethan had seen in his dreams. The wind moved through them, circling faster, lifting dust and leaves into the air. Ethan stepped forward, his pulse roaring in his ears. The whisper rose with him, swelling into something heavier, fuller. He could almost understand it now. Not language, but feeling, longing, recognition, as if the forest had been waiting for someone like him to arrive. Mara stayed at the edge of the clearing. "Don't step inside," she warned. "Once you do, it knows you're willing." The wind surged, pushing against Ethan's chest, urging him closer. The stones seemed to hum softly beneath the sound, vibrating with something unseen. For a moment, he thought he heard his own name carried on the breeze. The ground beneath his feet felt warmer, alive. All around them, the forest leaned inward. The whisper reached its loudest point yet, a chorus of half-remembered voices woven into the rushing wind. Ethan stood frozen, caught between fear and something else he didn't want to name. Behind him, Mara called out, but her voice was nearly lost in the sound. The wind tightened its circle, and just as Ethan felt himself begin to step forward, the whisper changed. It wasn't calling anymore. It was waiting. The waiting felt heavier than the noise ever had. The wind slowed, settling into a low, steady movement that pressed against the clearing like a presence holding still. Leaves hovered in the air before falling, as if time itself had hesitated. Ethan stood just outside the circle of stones, his body tense, his thoughts scattered. Whatever had been calling him no longer needed to speak. It knew he was there. Mara took a cautious step closer, keeping her distance from the stones. "It's changed," she whispered. "It doesn't do that unless—" She stopped, her breath catching. "Unless what?" Ethan asked, without turning. "Unless it's already taken something." The wind shifted again, this time moving inward instead of circling out. The whisper deepened, gaining weight, and within it, Ethan heard a sound that made his stomach drop. A familiar rhythm, a breath that matched his own. He staggered back a step. The clearing reacted. The stones vibrated softly, and the air above them shimmered, like heat rising from the ground. Shapes formed within the movement of the wind, not bodies, not fully, but impressions. Outlines that flickered and faded, as if memories were trying to remember themselves. Mara's voice shook. "Ethan, it's using you." The realization hit him slowly, settling in with a cold certainty. The whisper hadn't just been calling him. It had been learning him. His thoughts, his fears, the nights he couldn't sleep, the regrets he carried quietly. The forest ridge wasn't searching for someone. It had found a vessel. The wind surged toward him, stopping just short of the stones, as if testing the boundary. Within the sound, Ethan heard echoes of moments he recognized, his own voice layered with others, repeating fragments of thoughts he had never said out loud. "I didn't know," he said, though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to. "That's how it starts," Mara replied. "You don't offer anything. It takes what's already loose." The whisper rose, threading itself deeper into his mind. Images rushed past, faces without names, paths through the forest walked long before he arrived, hands brushing the same stones he now stood before. The wind carried the weight of all of it, pressing it toward him. Then something else emerged from the sound. A new tone, sharper, focused. Mara gasped. "It's not just you," she said. "It's pulling for me too." The wind shifted direction, brushing past Ethan and reaching for her. She stumbled, catching herself at the edge of the clearing. Her eyes widened as she listened, her face pale. "I hear my mother," she whispered. "She used to walk this ridge. I forgot how often." The forest responded immediately, the whisper growing louder, more urgent. The air tightened, drawing both of them toward the stones, as if the clearing itself had begun to breathe. Ethan felt a sudden clarity cut through the noise. The wind wasn't feeding on fear alone. It was feeding on connection, on shared memory, on the way two lives could overlap in the same place, offering more than one ever could alone. "We can't both stay here," he said. Mara shook her head. "If we leave now, it follows. If we stay, it finishes." The ground beneath the stones cracked softly, a thin line spreading outward like a warning. The whisper reached a pitch that made Ethan's ears ring, the sound layered thick with voices old and new. He felt himself slipping, his thoughts blurring, the edges of his identity softening. Then, from deeper within the forest ridge, another wind answered. It moved against the first, colder and slower, carrying a different sound. Not a whisper, but a low, distant hum that made the trees shudder. The clearing reacted violently, leaves spiraling upward as the two currents met. Mara stared into the darkness beyond the stones. "That's not supposed to happen," she said. "There's only ever been one." The wind hesitated, its hold faltering for just a moment. The whisper fractured, voices breaking apart, clashing instead of blending. The air trembled, charged with tension, as if the forest itself had been split between opposing intentions. Ethan felt the pull weaken, then surge again, stronger and more desperate. Whatever had found him was no longer patient. It was afraid. The stones glowed faintly in the moonlight as the two winds pressed against each other, the clearing caught in between. Ethan stood at the edge, breath shallow, heart racing, knowing with sudden certainty that the ridge was no longer deciding whether to take something. It was deciding how much, and the night was far from finished. The two winds collided with a force that Ethan felt in his bones. The whispering wind surged forward, desperate now, its calm patience stripped away. The colder wind answered with a low, steady pressure that pressed outward from the forest ridge, bending branches and flattening the grass in the clearing. The stones rattled violently, their hum rising into a sharp vibration that filled the air. Ethan dropped to one knee, his hands pressed against the ground as memories flooded him all at once. Not just his own, but fragments from others, people who had stood here before, drawn by the same restless pull. He felt their hesitation, their curiosity, their loneliness. The forest had not stolen them. It had absorbed what they were already carrying. Mara screamed as the whisper wrapped around her, lifting her hair, pulling at her thoughts. She staggered forward despite herself, dragged by the sound of her mother's voice woven into the wind. "No," Ethan shouted, forcing himself upright. He understood then what the ridge wanted. It wasn't trying to trap them. It was trying to complete something that had been broken for a long time. The whispering wind fed on unfinished stories, and the second wind, older, quieter, was what remained when those stories were finally released. The stones cracked again, deeper this time, light spilling from the fractures like a slow breath. The clearing pulsed, the winds tightening their hold, demanding a choice. Ethan stepped forward into the circle. Mara cried out, but the moment his foot crossed the boundary, the whisper locked onto him completely. The noise surged inside his head, louder than anything he had ever felt. His thoughts scattered, pulled apart, and laid bare. He felt the forest ridge reading him, measuring what he carried. "I'll stay," he said, voice shaking. "Take it from me." The whisper faltered. The colder wind surged, pressing against him, not pushing him away, but holding him steady. Ethan realized with sudden clarity that it wasn't another force at all. It was the echo of everyone who had stood here before and chosen to let go. The stones flared with light. The whisper screamed, not in anger, but in release. The sound tore through the clearing, ripping memories free, unraveling the tangled voices that had built up over years. Ethan felt his own weight lifting. Pieces of himself He hadn't realized he'd been carrying dissolving into the air. The wind howled one final time and collapsed inward. Silence followed. The forest ridge stood still, the trees unmoving, the air calm and empty. The stones dulled, their light fading until they were nothing more than old rock once again. Ethan fell forward, gasping, the ground cool beneath his palms. Mara rushed to him, pulling him back out of the circle. "Ethan," she whispered, "you're still here." He nodded weakly. The whisper was gone. Completely. The air felt lighter, clearer, as if the forest had exhaled after holding its breath for decades. Around them, the clearing looked ordinary, peaceful. They walked back down the ridge as dawn crept over the horizon, neither of them speaking. The forest no longer watched. The wind moved naturally through the trees, carrying nothing more than sound. By morning, the town felt different too, quieter but not tense. When Ethan passed people on the street, they smiled more easily. The woman at the store looked up from the counter and frowned slightly, as if trying to remember something she had just forgotten. "You look rested," she said. Ethan smiled faintly. For the first time in a long while, he felt it too. He packed his things that afternoon. The cabin no longer felt like a threshold, just a place. As he loaded his car, Mara stood nearby, arms folded, watching the forest ridge. "It's over," she said. "I can't hear it anymore." Ethan followed her gaze. The ridge stood quiet beneath the sky. "Neither can I." They said goodbye without ceremony. No promises. No explanations. Some things didn't need them. As Ethan drove away, the road curved gently out of sight of the forest. He felt lighter with every mile, as though something heavy had finally been set down. Miles behind him, a breeze moved softly through the trees. It was nothing like the whispering wind that once ruled the ridge. It carried no voices, no memories. Just the quiet sound of leaves shifting and branches swaying. And yet, deep within the forest, where the stones lay cracked and buried once more, the wind paused. For just a moment, it brushed across the clearing and changed direction. Not searching, not calling, listening. Ethan didn't realize how deeply the forest ridge had settled into him until days had passed and the silence still felt new. He returned to his old routines slowly. Sleep came easier now, settling over him like a calm tide instead of a struggle. When the wind moved outside his window at night, it sounded ordinary again, just air passing through streets and trees, carrying nothing meant for him. The whisper was gone, and with it, the sense of being pulled toward something unseen. Sometimes, though, he caught himself pausing when a breeze brushed past his ear. Not in fear, but in quiet awareness. As if listening had become a habit he could not entirely unlearn. Mara stayed near the ridge for a while after Ethan left. She walked the familiar paths during the day, stopping often, noticing how different the forest felt now. The air no longer pressed against her thoughts. The weight she had carried since childhood, the sense that something unfinished lingered just beyond reach, had softened. One afternoon, she climbed to the clearing alone. The stones were barely visible now, broken and scattered, half buried beneath leaves and soil. Nothing hummed. Nothing stirred. The place felt empty, but not hollow. More like a room after a long conversation had finally ended. She stood there for a long time, breathing in the quiet. "I remember you," she said softly, not sure who she meant. Her mother. The voices. The part of herself she had lost trying not to hear the wind. The forest offered no answer, and for the first time, she didn't need one. Life in the town slowly shifted, though few noticed it happening. People slept better. Conversations felt lighter. Some couldn't quite place why certain worries no longer followed them like shadows, but they welcomed the change anyway. The ridge remained part of the landscape, still avoided at night out of habit, but the fear that once clung to it faded into something closer to respect. Stories changed too. The old warnings softened into quiet reminders. The forest listens, people said, but they no longer spoke as if it were a threat. More like advice. A reminder to be careful what you carry with you when you walk alone. Ethan returned once, months later. He parked at the edge of town and walked the familiar road toward where the cabin had stood. It was gone now, taken down after the owner decided no one needed to live that close to the trees anymore. The space felt open, peaceful. The forest ridge rose in the distance, unchanged in shape but different in presence. It no longer seemed to lean toward him. It simply existed. Ethan didn't climb it. Instead, he stood at the edge of the trees and let the wind pass around him. It was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine and earth. No whispers. No pull. Just sound and movement the way it should be. He realized then that the ridge hadn't been evil or cruel. It had been full. Too full. It had held too many unfinished thoughts, too many voices left behind by people who never found a way to release them. When the wind had whispered, it wasn't calling for victims. It was searching for balance. Ethan had simply arrived at the right moment. He left the forest behind without regret. That night, as he drove away, he slept in a roadside motel, the window cracked open to let in fresh air. The wind brushed the curtains once, gently, then moved on. He smiled in the dark and drifted into deep, dreamless sleep. Far away, the forest ridge settled into its quiet rhythm. Leaves fell. Snow came and went. Seasons passed. The stones beneath the soil remained broken, no longer forming a circle, no longer holding memory. What had been gathered there had been released back into the world, lighter and scattered, no longer bound to one place. Sometimes, hikers spoke of how peaceful the ridge felt, how calm the nights were compared to other forests. Some said the wind there helped them think, helped them let go of things they didn't need anymore. They never heard whispers. And if, on rare nights, the wind seemed to pause, brushing gently through the trees as if listening, it carried nothing but the quiet understanding of a forest finally at rest. The whispering wind had found what it was looking for. Not a voice, not a memory, but an ending. And with it, the forest ridge learned how to be silent again.